So going back to this idea of what do you do with the pain, I'm just going to say it was wisdom from God. For me, there's no other way to describe how I was able to begin to lead our family in the middle of incredible searing pain myself. And I felt like he gave me the words to say, which was just simply something like this. I said, boys, we have two choices. We can continue to live our lives focused on our pain, focused on the tragedy, focused on the way that we lost Gabriel, the crash, all the things we're going to miss, which of course there are things that you do miss. But if that's our focal point, then we're going to be shadows of who God created us to be. But there's a second choice. And the second choice is, and I began to just talk about how Gabriel lived. And so I just told him, I said, he has lived adventurously. And so that's how we are going to honor his life. We are going to choose life. We're going to choose to live the way that we're supposed to live. And, obviously our desires and our passions were different than his. But whatever that looks like, that's what we're going to do to honor your brother.
Welcome to Linda's Corner, where we bring more hope, healing, and happiness to the world. My name is Linda Bjork, and today we're going to talk about being big, bold, and brave. I'm delighted to welcome Clint Hatton. Clint is a global influencer, speaker, transformational coach, and the author of Big, Bold, Brave: How to Live Courageously in a Risky World. You can reach Clint at his website, bigboldbrave.us, and I'll include a link in the show notes. Welcome, Clint. I'm so glad that you could join with me today.
Hello, Linda. I've been looking forward to it. Can't wait to have this talk.
I have been looking forward to this as well, because we have some connections in some of our stories. And your story is so layered with so many different pieces. Yeah. Where would you like to start?
Yeah, that's a great question. I always joke, I don't feel like I'm old. I'm only 57. But when you look at some of the life experiences on a piece of paper, it seems like a pretty long story. But, I think where I know we're going to go today, obviously, is a little more present, the last almost 4 years in particular. But I'll back up just a hair because I know a lot of our listeners have experienced a lot of different things in life. And the way I say it is, we've had some amazing experiences, beautiful things happen, many blessings. We really consider ourselves to be blessed, but we've had some pretty tough gut punches along the way. So I'll give a shotgun blast, if that's okay, Linda, so people can kind of get a little idea of just my overall journey, and then we can jump in wherever you want to jump in. But I grew up in sunny Southern California and really considered that I had a pretty normal childhood. So I didn't think it was anything, extraordinary or anything that wasn't normal. Athlete, played a lot, lots of sunshine. Back in those days, you could stay out until well after dark and nobody cared. It was just all those kinds of things. And then around 12, had some changes that made, life pretty tough for a while. My dad ended up cheating on my mom. They had been married over 25 years at that point. Actually got married at 18 and 16, which, obviously we don't hear too much about that nowadays, but, he fought in the Korean War and my mom was 16 waiting for him to come back. And, the rest is history. And so when he had that affair, obviously devastating for my mom. And I have an older brother, but my brother's almost 8 years older. And so he had already moved hundreds of miles away. So it was just my mom and I, because my dad moved in with this woman that he had the affair with and her son. So that was tough enough. But then my mom began to drink really heavy, trying to cope with the pain, ended up with suicidal ideation, attempted to take her life multiple times, a couple of times almost took me out with her, once in a speeding car and another time with a handgun where we heard a gunshot, found her in my closet and had to wrestle it away. And, some scary things. And the reason why I start with that is because at the age of now 12, 13, because this whole thing lasted about 2 years. I do want to point out really quickly, though, because it's going to be left in people's minds if I don't address it. After a couple of years, my parents did reconcile. They got back together. They actually ended up married for over 65 years. And we had a great relationship through my adult years. Both of them passed away about 8 years ago, so they're no longer with us. But I'm bringing that up because I want to kind of tie the bow on that part of the story. But what it did was it caused me to start chasing some, coping mechanisms that didn't serve me too well. So 12, 13 years old, started doing drugs, alcohol. Frankly, again, if it wasn't for the fact that I was an athlete too, who knows how bad that could have gone. But I love to compete. So I just, if I could say it this way, kept myself straight enough to be able to do that. Right. And so ultimately, that began at a very young age. And at the age of 19, I had kind of another punch in the gut. I had, well, actually two. I was a baseball player and a football player. My senior year of baseball, we were one of the top teams in Southern California. I was the returning star shortstop, ready to go, blew up my knee the first game and missed the entire season, which was a really hard thing. So again, I turned to a coping mechanism of partying, right? And then ended up rehabbing later on, moved to Northern California to play junior college football because I didn't have any offers at that point, coming off a knee injury. And had a couple of years where I was doing really well. And at the end of that second year, suffered what would be my final catastrophic knee injury that just kind of ended any chances I had of earning a scholarship and playing further. And so the reason why that matters is, as much as I'd love to be able to change my story and say, I was, Linda, so focused on academics, but that was not the case. Sports was kind of the driving factor, and academics, I did well in junior college academically, but it just wasn't what drove me. So again, I just kind of fell back into this heavy pattern of poor coping mechanisms, drug and alcohol abuse. Ended up getting into the car business at 21 years old, because at this point I'm like, well, I'm not going to finish school right now, so I might as well make some money. And that's where I was introduced to meth. And so I was a professional salesperson for many years, but I abused meth and, for almost 9 years. Had many, many experiences where I was up for days at a time, and just really not good, not a good way to try and move into your future. And, who knows what I was doing to my body and all those things. So ultimately, where that all left me is, by the time I was 30 years old, I had also got married. That marriage was, as you probably can imagine already, Linda, I was not prepared to be a good husband, right? I, obviously had lots of unhealthy patterns. And of course, my first wife was very much the same. We both had just a lot of baggage, a lot of hurt, a lot of pain that we carried into that. So we ended up in divorce. And it was then that I had some friends. I'd gotten involved in this business. It was a direct selling company. They sold nutritional products, and there was just something about them. And then they kept inviting me to church. I was not a church person, wasn't raised with faith through the church or anything like that. We would check the box, back in those days, you'd have forms you'd have to fill out for school and stuff like that. And, I remember mine usually said Catholic or Protestant. And so that was about it. And so we'd check the Protestant box. Didn't mean much. It just, we knew we weren't Catholic, right? So that said, I accepted this invitation, Linda, to church for one reason, at least in my mind, for one reason. And that was, these people I had spent quite a bit of time with for about a year or two. And I noticed that there was something different in the way they responded to the gut punches of life, because they had stuff happen too, like all of us do, like all of us suffer at different times, right? But for some reason, they always seem to have a peace about things. They always seem to carry hope. Those were not necessarily terms that I used in those days, but that's just, the best way to describe it. And so I'm like, okay, let's go see this thing that they do. And let's just see, what's in it. And that's really why I went. And the rest is kind of history, as they say. That was the day that I decided to give my life to God and started to walk in faith. And of course, that really began a huge shift in who I was, what drove me, how the type of person that I wanted to be. So my journey kind of launched out from there. And so over the course of time, I got really excited about the opportunity to have another relationship. And ultimately, my bride and I have been married over 20 years now. And we had 3 boys. 2 of those 3 were born prematurely. We had a miscarriage in between those. She had almost died in all 3 of those pregnancies. And of course, the 2 premature, the reason why they had to pull the boys out early is because she had a pregnancy disease that she kept getting every time she got pregnant. And our 3rd son was actually born at 1 pound, 14 ounces, almost 3 months early. So, a lot of scary situations in the midst of some really beautiful, joyous times where, God, however you want to say it, prospered us and blessed us and those things. And so that gives you, when I say a shotgun blast, that's a shotgun blast of just some of the ups and downs and ebbs and flows of what ultimately would, I think, help prepare me for what would end up being the biggest gut punch we would ever face.
You ready to talk about Gabriel yet?
Sure. We can do it.
Where does he fit out of the three sons?
Yeah. So Gabriel was the oldest.
The oldest. Okay.
And he was the oldest. And, Gabriel was, we all, anybody who has more than one child, obviously they have different personalities and different characteristics. And some things are common, some things are not. And we love them all and they're all extraordinary. But he was the firstborn, right? So he was very driven at a very young age, strong communication skills, even at 5, 6 years old. Just again, driven really is the best way to say it, really adventurous. And so ultimately where that would lead him and ultimately us as a family is at about 8, he had went up in a small aircraft with his uncle Danny, who owned a couple of planes. He ran a tiny little like rural municipal airport in Oklahoma. And so he went up with him and just got the juice, right? And I know you're going to be able to relate to that side of it. Just something happened to him for real. And he just was like, oh my gosh, I want to be a pilot. And so he's 8 and we're thinking, okay, fine. That's great. I mean, we always wanted to support our kids' dreams. Didn't think that was necessarily going to carry forward, until the point where he could actually do it. But it did, he hung on to it. And so by the time he was in high school, and this is going to play into it, you can ask me whatever you want to ask me about this part of our journey, but, we were pastors for 17 years during this time. And at the point when Gabriel was starting high school, that's what we did. And, there's anybody who is listening to this that understands that lifestyle knows that no one gets into becoming a pastor in a church for the 8-figure income, right? So, we weren't making a ton of money, and so we had no way. There was no physical means to be able to pay for him to go through a flight school, which is, as you know, is quite expensive. Yeah. And it was crazy. Favor just exploded in his life. One of the things that happened is we actually were in Seattle, Washington on staff at a church for several years and decided we want to move back to McKinney, which is a suburb of Dallas where we live now. And we'd lived there before. And we wanted to be back here near family. So when we came back and we moved back to McKinney, we had no idea until that summer when he's getting ready to start high school that they had instituted a 4-year aviation program in our McKinney ISD, which, is not typical. I don't know if there's any others around here. I'm sure somewhere in the country, someone's doing that, but it was unheard of. We're like, thank God, that's amazing. And so some of the educational components of him pursuing aviation was satisfied through high school for free, right? So there was no cost. And then at the same time, going into his freshman year, he had an opportunity to join a club a friend told him about. And it was at an airport that was like 7 minutes from our house, very close by. It was actually formed by a guy. His name is Kevin Lacey. And there's actually several listeners that may know who he is because Kevin's pretty well known in some circles in the aviation industry. He was the star of a show that was on Discovery Channel called Airplane Repo. And so he's exactly what it sounds. The guy repos airplanes for a living, and every airplane you can imagine all over the country. But he had this heart for teenagers. So for $50, I want this to sink in, Linda, $50 a year, you could be a part of this club. And the kids would go and hang out with him at his hangar. And he literally taught them everything about the physical side of things, how to do oil changes. They worked on engines. They painted planes. He had an enormous amount of contacts in the aviation industry. So he had flight instructors that donated their time for once the kids got old enough. Basically, the way it worked, Linda, is they had to earn their way there through sweat equity. And so, by the time he was 16, he had worked his tail off for 2 years, and he had the opportunity to start flying with flight instructors at no cost. Even the fuel we got for wholesale. I mean, Kevin had connections for everything. And so ultimately, at the age of 16, he soloed before he even had his driver's license here in Texas. And then at 17, which is the youngest, you can be to get your private pilot's license, he took the test, passed it the very first time, flying colors, took his check ride, blew it all away, and got his license at 17 years old. So it was an exciting time, and we felt like, gosh, this is just amazing. And you would also be aware of this, during that time, a lot of your listeners may not follow the aviation industry, but in 2019, which is now where we are in the story, there was a huge transition of a lot of pilots in the industry getting ready to retire. And so there was enormous opportunity coming. And we have a few friends that are really dear friends of ours as well that fly for American Airlines and some others. And of course, we're here in Dallas where American Airlines has a huge hub. And so there was a perfect gateway for him to be able to, become a pilot. Of course, you have to be 21 to get into that stage, but there was just a huge, it's like this open highway that had no traffic, and it was just going to be this perfect journey into his dream. So that's where we were. And then several months went by. And again, as you know, when it's a new pilot, not age, but just a new pilot, it's all about the hours. So he was flying as much as he could to try and get to that magical 1,500 hours, and was killing it, just doing really well. And everybody was impressed with his abilities. And, we were just so grateful that it seemed like the world was his oyster. And on September 23rd of 2019, it was just a normal Monday. A friend of his who he had graduated from high school with, he actually had about 20 friends that graduated from a high school here in McKinney and all went to the University of Arkansas. And so one of them was here over that weekend for a funeral of all things, and actually her mother asked, hey, Gabriel, can you fly her back to Arkansas so that she doesn't miss as many classes on that Monday? And he's like, absolutely, of course, because that's what he was doing. And he was also working on night hours at that point. So he flew her up there in the evening. It was still light when they left, dropped her off safely. And then on the return trip, by now it's night, and he was about 20 minutes out of Fayetteville. So he didn't get very far. And a couple of years later, we would get the NTSB report. As you're probably aware, when there's a plane crash, the NTSB is the one who jumps in and takes over. And it took almost 2 years to get their findings. But ultimately, he ran into an unexpected weather system and lost his horizon. And he flew into the mountainside and lost his life. And so, your world turns upside down. And, the loss of life, to lose a child is devastating in every way that anyone can imagine. And my heart goes out to anybody that's listening to this right now that has experienced that. I'm so sorry for your loss. It's a brutal experience. And in many ways, it's never going to go away, because there's this void that's always going to be there. And so the way I like to say it is I don't even pray, nor does my wife or my children. We don't pray for the pain to go away from his loss, because that pain just represents the love that we had, and the life that we shared. So it's not about that. But we did find ourselves in this, horrible position of, okay, now what do we do now? How do we cope with this? Our story has now shifted dramatically. And how do we live the rest of our lives? And so that brings us up to that fateful morning after the crash.
Wow. Thank you for being willing to share that story. And as we talk about different things, the loss of a child is so deep. Mm. And to be able to, you've talked several times about we all face hard things in our lives. They can be different hard things, but we all have hard things. So how do we cope? And in the past, you've had different methods to cope, and people use addictions because it helps. I mean,
Right.
They use things because it provides relief, and we're trying to escape pain, but it's not sustainable and it doesn't benefit us in the long run. It's a short-term fix that actually buries us deeper and deeper and deeper.
Right. Right.
So I am grateful that you were able to find another coping mechanism, something else, before you were hit with this gut punch, because the natural response is for our lives to just fall apart.
Right. Yeah, that's exactly right. And I love the way you frame that too. Because obviously alcohol and drug abuse in those situations is a pretty common thing. And, to your point, it can numb pain temporarily for the amount of time that, that you've taken in this substance, but it's a never ending cycle. Right. And as you said, it pushes the pain down. And so I want to start there. Because there's obviously a variety of things we've done over the course of time. It's been almost 4 years. And so there's not one thing, but I am going to share with you two really critical things. And so the first one is we established early on that we weren't going to try and push the pain down. And that may sound very simplistic, but one of the advantages I felt like I had, Linda, and when I say advantage, I'm not talking about an advantage with pain, because no one has an advantage with being able to deal with the pain of losing a child. But I had an advantage in that I had pastored for 17 years. My roles have always been very involved with mentoring and coaching, and that for many years included youth and young adult age people along with their families. So because of that, obviously, I've been involved in many really difficult situations with people over the years, helping them get through things, including many times the loss of a loved one and stillbirth and, just horrible circumstances. So the advantage was just simply that I had observed over time some healthier grieving and coping mechanisms that seem to help people continue to move forward in their life through the pain. And then I'd seen many instances, unfortunately, as you described a moment ago, where people tried to push it down, suppress it, or use very faulty coping mechanisms that literally just destroyed their lives. Many times marriages completely implode and end up in a divorce. And if that doesn't happen, the family unit, if it's extended, if there's, if it's not an only child situation, the family unit with the kids that are left in the wake of losing a sibling, it just implodes. So, I had seen that. And so the morning after the crash, my two youngest at the time were 9 and 14. They're now 18 and 13. And at that time, we let them sleep through the night. We don't need to get into the, all the details of what that night was like. But in short, we knew Gabriel disappeared off of radar at about 8 o'clock that night on that Monday night. We had a long night of misinformation, the search and rescue telling us one thing, that there was no information, news people in Arkansas posting things, including pictures that, like, how are they even getting this information? Because it was in a very rural area, supposedly no cell phone coverage, nothing. So I say all that to say it was a very long, nightmarish night. And we didn't know until 3:30 a.m. officially that he was indeed gone. So we let the boys sleep in. And when they came out, I had to give them the news, which I call the impossible conversation. Linda, I really honestly don't remember the words I used for that. I just had to tell them that Gabriel was gone. That's all I can tell you. And it was everything you can imagine. They're crying and wailing and disbelief and the whole 9 yards. It was just awful. But, once things settled down, I knew that I had to say something that would set a compass, And so going back to this idea of what do you do with the pain, I'm just going to say it was wisdom from God. For me, there's no other way to describe how I was able to begin to lead our family in the middle of incredible searing pain myself. And I felt like he gave me the words to say, which was just simply something like this. I said, boys, we have two choices. We can continue to live our lives focused on our pain, focused on the tragedy, focused on the way that we lost Gabriel, the crash, all the things we're going to miss, which of course there are things that you do miss. But if that's our focal point, then we're going to be shadows of who God created us to be. But there's a second choice. And the second choice is, and I began to just talk about how Gabriel lived, and obviously I just gave you a pretty significant part of who he was, but he also had taught himself guitar, and that was an amazing thing. Just YouTube videos, literally just learned how to play guitar. He did worship, with the team every once in a while. He became a photographer that you guys may be familiar with, the biggest air show in the country of its kind in Oshkosh. That was an annual trip that our team from here, Tango 31 was the name of the club, that they would make every single year. And just a couple of months prior to his crash, they gave him actually special access at the Oshkosh. He was the only photographer allowed actually onto the tarmac to take pictures. And so I have hundreds of incredible photos that he took. So, he was just adventurous. Basically, if there was something that he wanted to do, fear, finances, it didn't matter what the hurdle was, he was going to find a way, and he did it. And so I just told him, I said, he has lived adventurously. And so that's how we are going to honor his life. We are going to choose life. We're going to choose to live the way that we're supposed to live. And, obviously our desires and our passions were different than his, but whatever that looks like, that's what we're going to do to honor your brother, is by living. So that was part one. The second piece that goes along with that and is still tied to pain is because that doesn't address the pain side of things. And I just told them, listen, here's how it's going to work. We don't know what grieving is going to look like from day to day. Heck, in the early days and weeks, even from hour to hour for that matter. And I said, so here's our ground rules effectively. We are going to do this together. So if you're feeling like you need to cry, if you're feeling angry and you even need to cuss, now that's not something that we don't, that's not how we roll as a family. It's not that you don't ever hear a cuss word in our family, but it's just not part of who we are. But I told them that very specifically because there is anger that you have to deal with from time to time with situations like this. And I said, so even if you're so angry, you feel like you need to cuss, you need to know there is no repercussions. There's no penalty for that. There's nothing that's not okay. And so, but we're going to do it together. That's the one rule. We can express whatever we're feeling at any given time. We're going to ask each other questions from time to time. And whatever you're feeling is totally okay. And we're going to work through it together. And so that was how we launched out. And, I don't know where we're going to go with this or where we want to go with this, but I do want to point out quickly to people listening, because there are people who have already suffered a loss and some who, at some point might. And I want to point out once again, that was a compass. I use that word a lot because it wasn't that we did this perfectly or are doing it perfectly. It wasn't that we didn't have bad days. This isn't some phony, so we're just going to muster it up and we're just going to live this way and nothing's going to affect us. It wasn't that at all. It was that we are going to have pain and we're going to allow it. And we're going to work through it and we're going to experience it. And that's what we've done. And it's been incredibly helpful to us as a family. And I've learned since, because I've done a lot of these interviews now since I came out with my book in December. And even with licensed therapists, psychologists, doctors, different people that I've talked to, there's tons of data that this is an incredibly healthy way for you to process through very complex emotions and come out the other side in as healthy a version of you as you can imagine, And so those are some of the things we did early on, but it did change life forever.
And it will. So it's okay. Let's talk a little bit more about allowing people to feel, allowing yourself to sit with those uncomfortable, even miserable emotions. A lot of people are taught, and especially boys, you don't cry, you're not allowed to feel. And what it produces is we are afraid to feel. We are afraid of any kind of feeling because we don't know what to do with it. And when we have those big feelings, if there's no one to walk us through with it, then we try to get rid of it. Just
Right.
press it down.
That's right.
Anything I can do to compress it down because it hurts, or maybe it's confusing, or whatever those feelings are. So your example of allowing people to feel without, as you said, and if it's different than our normal
Right.
MO, the way that we run things, that's okay.
That's right.
We're in a different phase right now, and the rules have changed a little bit. We
That's
are
right.
playing adapt. We have a new situation, and we are rolling with it. So thank you for what you allowed your children and yourself. And now speaking out, it'll help other people who are going through things to say, do you mean I'm allowed to feel my feelings? And there's not somebody who's going to say, don't feel that way, or don't respond that way, or don't whatever that way. I think we'd have a much healthier world if everyone were able to respond in the way that you did.
Yeah. I mean, there's so much truth to that. And that often, when the way we frame this, this part of our story, it makes me sound like this superhero, but it's not like that at all. I don't consider myself to be extraordinary or unique or, any different than anybody else. But I think part of what helped me do what I needed to do was, I was raised in a different era. My dad, they had me very late. And as I already said, my dad fought in Korea. I mean, they came from a very different generation. When I was a kid growing up and we'd have an injury, he'd say stuff like, rub dirt on it or tape an aspirin to it. We'd joke about stuff like that. So I was not raised to express feelings. Now, that said, over the course of time, I've always been someone who is willing to be vulnerable with my story. I would share things with people, but not necessarily vulnerable with my emotions. And so when this all happened, again, I did have the advantage of having 17 years of working with people. And I've always been a student of not just, Christianity, even in being a pastor, neuroscience, even psychiatry to some degree. I study a lot of different things to have a better understanding about how we are created and what we may have learned. So there's a lot of that mixed in, Linda, that I need to point out. It's not like I just randomly somehow was able to come to this conclusion that we need to allow ourselves to feel this. I had been a student of the human condition, if I could say it that way. That said, it was imperative. I just felt like as the dad, it was going to be the most critical that I led by allowing my own emotions to be shown. Because it's one thing to tell your even my bride, Amaryllis, it's one thing to tell her, this is how we're going to do it, and tell my boys, this is how we're going to do it. But if I didn't demonstrate it, then there would have been like a cap on that. And so I just allowed myself, because there was many times, even to this day, there's many times where triggers hit and I tear up and I cry, and it's, often small and subtle. And, we're not talking about, weeping and snot coming out of your nose and uncontrollable. We had some of those moments too early on, but I just allowed myself to feel those emotions in front of them and explain to them what I was feeling in the moment. Now, here's part of the reason why this is also critical, because one of the other things that we had to do, and this is what people really struggle with, I've discovered with loss in particular, and in a family dynamic for sure, but sometimes even outside of a family dynamic. And that is, people are afraid to even talk. Many people suppress it and push it down because they're unwilling to have what I call a courageous conversation. So this process I'm describing didn't only involve, we were feeling something, and so we just openly expressed it. There were times that we had to excavate it, because the human nature is to want to push things down. So an example might be, many times I may be feeling like, okay, I'm okay today. And, because there's joy in the midst of all this stuff. We still had laughter in our home. That was one of the things we talked about. We do have conversations when we talk about Gabriel and we miss him and it makes us cry. But there's other times we talk about some of the crazy stuff that he did or his personality and makes us laugh, right? So it's all of those things. But what would happen is I may be feeling great. And let's say Amaryllis throughout the day may look like she's doing good. But when you have dealt, or when you're dealing with such a difficult, traumatic experience, what you see on the face of things is not necessarily the truth of what's going on inside. So we gave each other permission and we practiced. Hey, and for us, we had just a simple phrase, for those listening, you can come up with a very simple question that kind of everybody knows. Okay, we're shifting gears. We're trying to talk about something here. I would just look at her and just say, how are you doing with Gabriel? And here's the truth, Linda. There would be times where, okay, I'm okay today. I'm okay today. There'd be other times where seconds before we were jovial and she was smiling, and I would ask that question and she would immediately burst into tears, or vice versa. She would ask me, how are you doing with Gabriel? And the same thing, I may be okay. And then there's other times where I may just immediately, burst into tears. So that's really important, because that's all part of working through the emotion, working through the real pain of the loss, and allowing yourself to talk it out. And what happens is people may or may not recognize this. I talk about this a lot when I'm working with a client as well, is people don't recognize sometimes that we were created this way, right? We were created as emotional beings. We didn't choose it. It's just integrated into our DNA, right? And even scripturally, we see even Jesus himself, he had different emotions that we read about. It's a different emotion when you're going through the temple and you're throwing this whip around, right? Than when Lazarus dies and he weeps because he saw the weepers. So we're emotional beings, and that's okay. We were designed that way. But we're not always good at understanding that life is a series of exchanging emotions. We exchange emotions all day long, every single day, our entire lives, on complete autopilot. I'll give you an example. I'm in a great mood. I'm walking out front to get the mail, and I stub my toe and it's bleeding. I have an instant emotion change, right? Might be anger. It may just be pain. And I'm like, oh gosh, and that's a funny example, but it's true. We can shift very quickly. You can be in a great mood and then get a phone call, or someone, your coworker or your boss or your spouse or your child says something, and it triggers a very different emotion that you immediately slip into, right? So these are all very natural occurrences. What we learned to do through the grieving process and the trauma process was to allow that emotion that stirred up. And sometimes it was anger. Sometimes it was. Sometimes we were angry at God. We were angry at why us? Why did this happen? I'll just give you the poor me part. Here we've been in ministry, really pastoring for 17 years, but in quote unquote full-time ministry for 22 years. We've been faithful. How could this happen to us? All of those things. So we would allow ourselves to experience that. And what happens is when you move through an emotion, then it allows you to now slip into the next emotion that's appropriate for what's next in your situation. Can I give you a quick example?
Absolutely.
Okay, so here's a quick example. I've shared this story many times, but I think it bears repeating. So a couple of years go by. This is not in the immediacy of the traumatic experience. We're in Florida. It's the 4th of July weekend. We're visiting family down there. Her father lives down there with his wife, and they have a boat. By the way, I hadn't mentioned this part yet, but it's really important to this part of the story. My wife is full-blown Puerto Rican. So this is the Puerto Rican side of her family. So it's the 4th of July. We're out on an island on my father-in-law's boat in Florida on a beautiful day, and they're Puerto Rican. That matters because it's a party, right? So we're having a great time. And there's multiple boats. A bunch of the friends are out there, music going on. And Linda, everything was great. And then all of a sudden, I still can't quite remember what the trigger was. I want to say I saw a plane flying by because we were in a path where there was just a lot of activity with aircrafts. But at some point, I just started thinking about Gabriel. And, again, this is a couple of years down the road. So by now I've practiced this often, but I just knew I need to feel. this right now. I missed him. So it was a party. We're on the beach, and hanging out in the back of the boat and in the water. And I just kind of bobbed away from everybody about 20, 30 feet. And again, it was loud. It was, it's a 4th of July weekend. Nobody even noticed what I'm doing. And I bobbed over 20, 30 feet and I just started to weep, and allow myself to feel what I was feeling. That just missing him really was what it was about that day. And that went on for probably 30, 40 minutes. I just sat in it, literally just sat in it and looked out over the ocean, had thought about, different experiences that we had and some beautiful moments, some tough things, because we had tough things too, like you do with any kid, and I allowed myself to feel it. And then that worked its way through my body. Now, science is proving to us now that even those emotions carry toxins in your body. So there's a literal physical side to this too. And I just felt as if it's almost like a flush. I felt like, okay, I'm done. And then I exchanged that emotion of sadness for joy. Now that sounds almost robotic, but it's absolutely what happened. And how I did it was I wiped it. I was wearing glasses, so nobody even saw me crying. I just wiped my face and I bobbed my way back over to where the party was. At this point, people are eating in the back of the boat. I jumped in the back of the boat, grabbed some food, and I began to have a great time. And I sincerely began to have a great time.
And that's what's so special about your story, because you could hear 100 people tell a story of you're in a party situation, you're missing your son, you're feeling those feelings. And so I'm at a party. I got to suppress these feelings. I got to eat some food. I got to pretend to be happy. I got to shove it down.
Mm-hmm.
And didn't. You allowed it. And that's, I think, part of the magic of your message is that allowing those feelings to flow through you. And as you described it as a flush, it doesn't mean you have to stay there and live in misery forever. Allowing yourself to grieve, allowing yourself to be sad does not doom you to a lifetime of misery. It is allowing those feelings to flow through you so that there is space for the joy.
Yeah,
so Clint,
that's exactly right.
Thank you for your message. Thank you for sharing today. You are amazing.
Well, thank you. I appreciate it. And again, I just want to reiterate with everybody listening, I appreciate the kind words. And I know there's been some healthy things that we did that are helping people. But again, I want everybody listening to know we don't feel like we're superheroes or unique or anything else. It's just we've learned some of these things and we apply them. And it's sometimes hard work. It's not easy to do. Sometimes we mess it up, but it's worth it. And so I want to encourage people. I actually just wrote about this. I'll say this really quick, Linda, because I know we're about out of time. Interestingly enough, this last Friday, I published a weekly newsletter and I wrote about this because I don't write about grief all the time. My book isn't even a grieving book. It does cover some of the grieving process, but it's far greater than that. It's mostly about overcoming fear and really, taking on life. But two of the things that matter the most when you're in situations like this is drawing in the people that love you enough to be able to sit in it with you, because we had a handful of people that applied. Many couldn't. We still have people to this day that we knew that, were very dear friends and haven't talked to in years because they can't probably handle even our story, now. And that's just reality. But we brought in some of those people. And the second thing that I wanted to leave people with is you have to gauge your capacity. So there were many times, to your point, that we may be in an environment where it's a party. And you know what? I'm not feeling it. I don't have the capacity today to interact with all these people and potentially be asked questions and tell my story or any of that kind of stuff. And so we learned to say no to a lot of things as well. And so there were times when you just have to know that today's not the day. And I need to be alone. I need to be with my family, whatever that looks like.
And that is being brave to draw those boundaries and to claim your space of what you need. So again, thank you.
You're welcome.
In closing, I'd like to share a quote by Queen Latifah. She said, "Be bold, be brave enough to be your true self." Today, I invite our listeners to be big, bold, brave, and resilient. See you next time on Linda's Corner. Thanks for listening. Please share and subscribe to help us reach new listeners. And if you'd like to heal your life from the inside out, there is a free video series at hopeforhealingfoundation.org. Just click on the Free Stuff tab. I also invite you to grab a copy of one of my books, like Crushed, A Journey Through Depression, and You Got This, an action plan to calm fear, anxiety, worry, and stress. See you next time on Linda's Corner.